I would like to ask Andrew to do a talk about his manta ray work. Andrew McLeod is working as assistant curator at the moment in Hull, in the Deep, but he has been working there already for 13 years and have been doing different jobs there, but now he's in a project on the manta ray. Please.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. This is a project that's it's a fieldwork-led conservation project we're really privileged and quite proud to be part of with the Cousteau Foundation. It's a project that's taking about 5 years, and it's first started last year in October 2012. This project, it's a large sort of umbrella project, and we're feeding into it. So the important bit here really is the number of collaborators and making sure that we can be as succinct as possible in the area around the Red Sea. It's well known for its diversity. At the moment, in certain areas, it suffers the same as everywhere else in the world, with lots of environmental pressures around it, both human impacts. However, Sudan itself is currently considered to be pristine. It has a wide diversity and, excuse me. Initially, the project is designed to work from a top-down type of entry into the... using a top-down control is often the most effective way to manage an ecosystem, and the sharks and rays are there as part of the top-down point. The sharks themselves are more for the ecosystem, and the health of the ecosystem is really, really important. If you focus on sharks themselves, they are an animal that controls the ecosystem itself, whether that's looking after the animals from ill or sick animals, they'll take those, so they're a good indicator species for the health of the reefs themselves. Okay, why mantas? Why not, I suppose? They're a large, charismatic and highly valuable flagship species with an international profile, and feeding vital information from manta rays and the sharks into an umbrella project that's coordinated by the Cousteau Foundation for the conservation and management of sharks in the Red Sea. It's a huge undertaking, and very part of the conservation needs for it. Now, Sudan itself is very proactive where it can be, and it's developed 2 marine protected areas in and around its coastlines in an attempt to try and protect its biodiversity, and has introduced a ban on shark fishing in the areas. However, it doesn't really have any ability to police the areas currently. And while we were there on the project itself, you can see this is a long line that was actually caught by one of the dive operators actually on the marine protected areas while we were there. Sharks and rays, the pressures facing sharks and rays isn't going away, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. The pressures from the South China dried seafood markets particularly is seeing an increase in the capture of manta rays, both directly and indirectly. And it's sad to see that they're following exactly the same route as sharks. Manta rays themselves, their life history, they take a long time to reach sexual maturity, around about 10 years, and they only produce a pup every 2 or 3 years, which means they're on a bit of a hiding to nothing. However, the estimated tourist industry around these animals is significantly more than the value of the animals, whether they're dead. It's estimated at the moment that the manta rays globally, as a tourist industry for diving, is worth around about $100 million, whereas the gill rakers themselves, the industry around that, is worth about $11 million, but unfortunately that is ever and ever increasing. The other example there are the grey reef sharks. Currently, they reckon a grey reef shark is worth around about $10,000 annually to the ecotourism and diving industry, whereas they reckon they're worth around about $25. Unfortunately, there is a flip side to it. The unregulation of the diving industry can add in severe pressures as well. Sudan has an advantage on that point in that it's fairly isolated. With it being fairly isolated, it's a difficult place to get to. The logistics aren't really well developed. That means that the types of divers that go there tend to be slightly more competent, tend to have slightly more marine awareness, which means that they have a better respect for their environment. And the dive operators themselves, they police themselves, they all know each other, so they don't tend to all pile into one area. They keep themselves well spread out. But there's a real concern out in Sudan, particularly with it being on the coastline next door to Egypt, where the infrastructure that's been developed around the diving industry is very much greater, with liveaboard boats. Now, they're drifting further and further into the area, and they have this real feeling that because it's not theirs, they don't feel the need to look after the environment as much. The infrastructure's there, so generally the holidays are cheaper too. So longer term, with the concern of having increased diver tourism in the area, the Cousteau Foundation has been working to try and bring as many of the different areas, different countries with the dive operators together to produce a code of conduct and a best practice. But really, in order to do that, the most important thing is to get the benchline data on the animals themselves. The Cousteau Foundation has a long history out in the Sudan, with Conshelf 2 back in 1963, and it also helped in developing the National Coastal Zone Management of 2005. So they've spent a long time out in the area, but moving forward with the professors that are already there, they need to try and get more information, which is where we came in. As you can see in the bottom picture there, that's Ben and Graham, who actually took part in the field work. So the Integrated Coastal Zone Management, it's a European Commission funded work towards responsible, sustainable development of conservation management and maintenance areas with exceptional biodiversity, while still trying to access the ecosystem for the local populations to alleviate poverty and resolve conflict. So it's this really, really all-encompassing project itself to actually manage the entire area. And I guess you do have to start somewhere. And you start with the local government again. The Sudanese are proactive, as I've already mentioned, but the Wildlife Administration wanted to be more involved, and as part of the project they are hand in hand with it. So they were out on the boats, which for them was a relatively new thing. The Wildlife Administration itself, some of the individuals had actually never been on a boat, and there was a real feeling that they were quite scared about being on the boats because of the reputation that mantas had in the area. Whereas having them involved is so important, but then the local population itself, like the fishermen and the dive operations, and bringing them all together to work for the environment. So this is Sudan. Let's see whether that's going to work. This is the actual location of the Dunganab Bay Regional. In total, this area was 3,000 kilometres of marine protected reserves actually on the Sudan. And this is Dunganab Bay just here. So first things first, when they got there, they conducted some reef transect surveys. Again, this is to follow on from the original Integrated Zone Management paperwork that was produced in the first instance, and this was a replicator to go back into the areas to find out how the diversity had changed over the last few years. And thankfully, the result was quite good. So that was first things first, to get back into the sort of way of life of the diving, if you like. Then for the project itself, these were the key questions for us on our project, of what we needed to answer to feed back into the integrated coastal zone management. A lot of the work with working with the dive operators, Cousteau had spent some time with them already over the last few years, and had given them video and recording equipment, so they logged as much information as possible while they were out there diving, and then produced this original sort of spot type information which we could take and build on. So it told us things like where the aggregations of the mantas were and at time of year, so it gave us a good start in being able to get out there to start to answer the more succinct questions, like why were they there at that time of the year? Was it for feeding? Was it for breeding? Are these nursery grounds? And these are the types of questions that need the answers to feed back into the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan. So the first thing was to install some ground monitoring equipment. So there's the acoustic sensors that were put into the inshore areas and offshore, just slightly further off again. And these acoustic monitors were put in place. A series of 40 were put in place there, and you can see the dots replicate where they were around that area, covering around about 130 kilometres of the coastline. The monitors themselves, they work on a process where the animals that have been tagged, they pass within about 500 metres, they download all that information onto them and then send it back up. So the first ever internal tagging on manta ray, on shark species, was carried out there. This is Dr. Nigel Hussey and Dr. Steve Kressel from the University of Windsor have pioneered a technique where they're able to actually insert the tags into the sharks themselves, working with halibut and Greenland sharks. Now, the point of this being that historically, with the tags themselves, they only last for a few weeks or so on the animals. But if you actually insert them, the battery life in these tags is over up to 10 years. So the ability to gain much more data, which is so important, feeding back into the project. And they get so good at that, this sort of process only took 25 minutes. But while that was going on, we were able to take further information such as size, the GPS location, DNA data was taken, the sex, clasper length to indicate maturity, and then the ID was taken from the manta rays as well, so we can try and build a bigger picture of the population out there. While we were out there too, we noticed during the tagging process, we tagged around about 35 individuals. It was noted that one of them appeared to exhibit characteristics of both the different species. Taking the DNA samples from there, it was found that on the RAG1, which is a nuclear gene, and on the mitochondrial gene ND5, they were reciprocally monophonetic. And it was found that it was both in forward and reverse, that this species was able to be heterozygous on both sides. So proving that they had a hybrid, possibly the first one found and kept in the wild, based on a separation of species back in 2012, where the genome was mapped out. There had been no reported hybrids of this species. So going back to the fieldwork itself and carrying on with the spot tags, there was a different type of satellite spot tag was used, as well as the monitoring spot tag over a longer period, and that's the spot 5 tags. These take 250 transmissions per day for 280 days, so they build up almost a seasonal picture of how the animals are moving around in the area. There's a lot more data to be taken from these, because there's 5 tags deployed back in 2012, which have been monitoring. But so far it appears that around the Dunganab Bay area was where the rays spent most of the time. Other important information that was taken at the same time while we were out there was water sampling. So that's temperature, salinity, and depth, and this all feeds back into a larger picture on the project itself in terms of what the water quality and the conditions seasonally for why the animals are there at that time. I included in that was plankton sampling. It being a food source for the manta rays, they're deliberately taking plankton samples both at the sites where mantas were found to be feeding, but also where areas of just slicks of plankton were found. There's been some work done with basking sharks, the indication on the densities of plankton. In certain areas, the sharks will stop feeding and moving on again, and the indications are early on that it appears to be something similar with the basking shark, with the manta rays of the basking sharks. So that's roughly a summary there of the project as it took place in 2012. And moving forward, for the next 4 years, we're going to expand on into moving to other species of sharks as well to build up a bigger picture to feed back into this integrated coastal zone management. And there are some acknowledgements there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Are there any questions?
How do you get the manta rays to hold still while you plant the tanks?
The manta rays, we pioneered a technique of tonic mineralization, so we turn them over on their backs. And you did that by facing the boats into the currents and tipping their rays, and the current with the water passing around was able to turn them over. And they held really, really still through tonic immobility, and you were able to put the tags in. Say again?
They caught them by hand, did they?
Yeah, originally for the actual capture itself, they used a hook through the mouth and towed with some barrels on behind them, waited, followed them round, and once they got to a area where they were slowed in their swimming pattern, you were able to get them over onto the backs, cut the hook out, and then perform the procedures and let them go again.
What happens with the tags once their battery life is over?
With these animals, because they've been tagged and ID'd, we're able to find them again and surgically be able to remove the tags out of them.
Any other questions? I have one small question. Do you put this also on the internet, that you can follow, for example, one animal, that the public can see what is happening with such a project? Is
yes,
that worth
we haven't
doing,
yet.
or is it dangerous to do that?
I guess from a flip side of that would possibly be for, if you like, the dive operators in the area would be able to log on to track the animals. And I think for the Sudanese dive operators, it would be useful information for them, because they're quite proactive in the way that they look after manage their populations on the doorstep, if you like. So they would be quite mindful of where they are, whereas some of the other dive operators that are coming into the area, it's possible maybe not so, so they would take it as an opportunity to just find the animals very quickly. So it may be better not to produce that sort of publicly yet.
Yeah, but even if you do it in a wider angle, that you don't know exactly where they are.
It'd certainly be really interesting longer term for us sat at home, for example, to see.
Okay. Thank you very much.